Imagine a weapon so massive that it required 500 men to operate. A gun so powerful it could destroy an entire fortress with a single shot. A railway cannon so enormous that it needed its own custom-built tracks just to move into position. This isn't science fiction. This is Schwerer Gustav, Heavy Gustav, the largest artillery piece ever used in combat, and perhaps the most audacious example of Nazi Germany's obsession with superweapons during World War II. Today, we're diving deep into the incredible and terrifying story of this 1,350-ton monster that embodied both the pinnacle of engineering achievement and the absolute madness of total war. The story of Gustav begins not in Nazi Germany, but in the trenches of World War I. After that war ended, France constructed the Maginot Line, a massive system of fortifications along its border with Germany, featuring concrete bunkers, underground facilities, and artillery positions that France believed would make their border impregnable. When Adolf Hitler came to power in the 1930s and began planning for war, he became obsessed with finding a way to breach these fortifications. In 1936, Hitler approached the Krupp Arms Manufacturing Company with a seemingly impossible challenge: design a weapon capable of penetrating 7 meters of reinforced concrete, or 1 meter of solid steel armor. The chief engineer, Erich Müller, took on this challenge and spent the next few years designing something the world had never seen before. The result was Schwerer Gustav, named after Gustav Krupp, the head of the Krupp family company. Construction began in the late 1930s at the Krupp factory in Essen, Germany. The project was shrouded in secrecy, but what emerged was nothing short of extraordinary. Let me give you some numbers that will help you understand just how massive this weapon truly was. Schwerer Gustav weighed 1,350 tons. That's roughly the weight of 400 cars. The entire assembly was 155 feet long, about half the length of a football field. It stood 38 feet tall, roughly the height of a 3-story building. The barrel alone was 106 feet long and had a caliber of 800 millimeters. That's 31.5 inches wide. But here's where it gets truly insane. The shells this gun fired weighed between 4.8 and 7 tons each. To put that in perspective, that's heavier than most elephants. These weren't just big bullets. They were flying buildings. The weapon required 2 parallel sets of railway tracks to support its weight. Standard tracks simply couldn't handle it. It took a crew of 500 men to assemble, operate, and protect the gun, commanded by a major general. An entire flak battalion was assigned just to defend it from air attack. Setting up Gustav was an operation in itself. It required 250 men working around the clock for 3 weeks just to assemble the gun and prepare the tracks. Another 2,500 men were needed to lay the special railway tracks required for its deployment. The gun could fire 2 types of ammunition: high-explosive shells weighing 4.8 tons that could penetrate 7 meters of concrete, and armor-piercing shells weighing 7 tons that could punch through 1 meter of steel armor. The range was approximately 29 miles for high-explosive shells and 23 miles for armor-piercing rounds. Ironically, Gustav never fired a single shot at the Maginot Line, the very target it was designed to destroy. When Germany invaded France in May 1940, they simply went around the fortifications through Belgium, making Gustav unnecessary. The gun sat unused until 1942, when Germany was deep into Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The weapon finally saw combat at the Siege of Sevastopol in Crimea. Sevastopol was one of the most heavily fortified Soviet positions, featuring massive concrete bunkers, underground ammunition depots, and coastal fortifications that had resisted German assault for months. The German High Command decided this was the perfect opportunity to unleash Gustav. In June 1942, after weeks of preparation, Schwerer Gustav opened fire. The results were devastating. The gun fired approximately 48 rounds over several days of bombardment. Each shot created a massive explosion visible from miles away, with a sound that was absolutely deafening. One of Gustav's most notable achievements was destroying an underground Soviet ammunition depot located 100 feet beneath the waters of Severnaya Bay. The 7-ton armor-piercing shell penetrated through the earth and water, causing a catastrophic explosion that destroyed the entire facility. The gun also successfully destroyed Soviet coastal battery fortifications and concrete bunkers that had withstood weeks of conventional artillery bombardment. Witnesses described the impact of Gustav's shells as creating craters large enough to swallow houses, with shock waves that could be felt miles away. However, despite its destructive power, Gustav's military effectiveness was questionable. The rate of fire was incredibly slow. At best, it could fire 14 rounds per day. The barrel wore out after firing only about 300 rounds and needed to be replaced. The logistics of moving, assembling, and protecting such an enormous weapon consumed vast resources that Germany desperately needed elsewhere. After Sevastopol, Gustav was deployed to Leningrad in 1942, but never fired there. It saw brief action again near Warsaw in 1944, during the suppression of the Warsaw Uprising, though accounts of its use there are less well documented. As the tide of war turned against Germany, Gustav became more of a liability than an asset. The weapon was incredibly vulnerable to air attack and partisan sabotage. Moving it required control of railway networks that Germany was rapidly losing. In early 1945, as Allied forces closed in from both east and west, the Germans decided to destroy Gustav to prevent its capture. The gun was blown up by German engineers near Auerbach in Bavaria, leaving only fragments and photographs as evidence of its existence. A sister gun called Dora, nearly identical to Gustav, was also built and saw limited service, primarily at Stalingrad. Dora met a similar fate, destroyed by German forces to prevent capture. Today, no complete examples of these railway guns survive. A few components and fragments can be found in museums, but the guns themselves exist only in historical records, photographs, and the memories of those who witnessed their terrible power. The barrel of Gustav was reportedly cut up for scrap, and most of the surviving components were melted down in the post-war period. Some small pieces are held in various military museums around the world, including remnants of the mounting systems and railway components. So, what's the verdict on Schwerer Gustav? Was it a masterpiece of engineering or a colossal waste of resources? From an engineering perspective, Gustav was absolutely remarkable. It represented the absolute pinnacle of what could be achieved with 1940s technology in terms of artillery design. The precision required to manufacture components of this scale, the calculations needed to fire accurately at extreme ranges, and the logistics of making such a system functional were extraordinary achievements. But from a military perspective, Gustav was arguably a disaster. The resources consumed in building, transporting, and operating Gustav could have produced hundreds of conventional artillery pieces or dozens of tanks. The strategic impact of the gun was minimal. While it could destroy individual fortifications, it couldn't change the course of battles, let alone the war. Gustav exemplified Nazi Germany's fascination with wonder weapons, the belief that technological superiority and overwhelming firepower could compensate for strategic and tactical failures. This mentality diverted resources from practical weapon systems to impractical superweapons like Gustav, the Maus super heavy tank, and eventually the W2 rocket program. Military historians generally agree that Germany would have been better served by investing in more practical weapons and defensive systems, particularly fighter aircraft and anti-tank weapons that could have been produced in large numbers. Yet Gustav remains endlessly fascinating. It represents human ambition and engineering pushed to absolute extremes. It's a reminder that during total war, nations will attempt the seemingly impossible, regardless of whether it makes strategic sense. Schwerer Gustav stands as one of the most extraordinary weapons ever created, a monument to both human ingenuity and the destructive madness of the Second World War. It was the largest gun ever used in combat, a weapon so massive it seems to belong more in science fiction than history. While Gustav's military impact was limited, its legacy endures as a symbol of the extreme measures nations will take in wartime, and as proof that bigger isn't always better when it comes to military technology. If you like this video, please like, subscribe, and share. Leave a comment telling us what World War II topic you'd like us to cover next. Thank you for watching.